Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome to Testing with Django and Pytest. In the first part of this tutorial series, we showcased how to set up Pytest with Django. In this tutorial, we focus on Pytest fixtures. Just before we explain what fixtures are, let's just take a step backwards here and have a look at a pattern for writing tests. There are several different kinds of tests. Unit test, integration test, end-to-end test, functional test. Essentially, they all do the same basic thing. They try something and report pass or fail. We could think of a simple test as having three stages: arrange, act, assert. At the arrange stage, we prepare any state you would need to perform the action you want to try. So let's just quickly go through this as if we were writing a test. So the first stage, arrange. So first of all, we need to prepare any state we will need to perform the action you want to try. Does the test require any objects or special settings? Does it need to prepare any database, or do we need a database at all to run the test? Do we need to log into any web app? Do we need to connect to our API? So the arrange stage here is trying to prepare in readiness to then perform the action, the second phase, the act. So now we can move to the second phase, the act or the action. At this point, we perform an action. So this could be calling a function or method, maybe calling a REST API, or interacting with a web page, for example. Typically, the act step should elicit some sort of response. So at this point, we should have some sort of response. That could be a HTTP response. That could be some data that's returned from an API, for example. So at this point, we can now move to the third stage, assert. So here we could say we want to assert expected outcomes. Now we can take the response from the action or the act, the second phase, and we can test it against the known or expected outcome of performing the action in the second phase. So for example, if we were meant to return some data in the second phase here, the act, then the assert is going to test to see if that data was indeed returned. Of course, if we do assert the action or the act and we have returned the expected outcome, then we return true, and therefore the test has passed. So with this pattern in mind, let's have a look to see where fixtures can be utilized within this paradigm. So what is a Pytest fixture? So a fixture, these fixtures are just functions. They run before or after each test function to which the fixture is applied. So straight away, you could possibly see where this fixture will be utilized in the arrange phase, because in the arrange phase, we're preparing the data, or we're preparing for the action to be performed. So in this case, the fixtures, which are functions, they're going to run before each test. So here, for example, like I said, we can run this before the action. So in actual fact, a fixture can, in this paradigm here, be run before the action or the act. So we're going to use a fixture, for example, to collect data from a database or to prepare a database connection so that we can perform a function within the act to return some sort of result. And then we can assert the result to check to see if we've returned the expected outcomes. So almost to summarize, fixtures are used to feed data to the tests, such as database connections, URLs to test, and input data. So at this point, we've probably spoken enough about what a fixture is. So let's go ahead now and put this into action and provide you some examples. So you will find this project code in the description of the video. So by all means, go ahead and just download and get this started. If you're not too familiar with Django, just move back to the first tutorial. I'll take you through the steps of building a Django application and getting started. So let's go ahead and build a Pytest fixture. So in order to indicate to Pytest that we've built a fixture, we can use the Pytest declarator here. So at Pytest.fixture. And now we're just building a simple function. So def fixture 1. And inside of here, I'm going to print out run fixture 1 so we can see that the fixture has run. And then I'm just going to return 1. So think of this as the setup for a test, for example. So now I can go ahead and utilize this fixture within my test here. So let's bring in the fixture and then we can start utilizing it. So we create this variable num equals fixture. So we bring that into our variable here and then we run an assert. So num, which should represent the number 1, should be equal to 1. So we're utilizing this fixture to prepare some data for us then to, in this case, we're just bringing this in. We're not running a function at all here. We're just bringing this in to a variable here and running to a test to see if our num equals 1. So let's go ahead and run this. So you can see the output that we're going to return here, but let's just run Pytest. So that runs okay. So now we can run the report. So let's run RP. And at this point, we can now see the printout has returned. So that indicates that this fixture is being run by Pytest. So let's go ahead now and add a print here. So this time we want to run the example 1. So now when we run this again, you can see that our fixture is being run and also our example. So by default, a fixture is run once per test. So that is the default behavior of a fixture. Now what we might want to do is we might want to run this fixture over multiple tests, for example. So we can actually do this by defining the fixture in a different way. So we need to flag this fixture as, for example, a module or a session. So it's only run once. Right, so let's go ahead and do that. So we need to, first of all, flag this fixture as, for example, a module. So we do that by adding a scope here, equals, and then in this case, let's just do session. Okay, so let's just run the test again. So you can clearly see that our fixture is running. Now, something I didn't show, let me just, let's just get rid of that for now. For example, let's just make another test here, just to show that the fixture is running once per test. So let's call this test 2, an example 2. So if I were to run this, you can see that every time a test runs, our fixture is also running. So let's now go back into our fixture and let's just change the scope to module or session. So let's run our tests again. And this time you can see the fixture is only running once and we're reutilizing it for both example 1 and example 2 test. So I did mention at the start, fixtures can be used at the start and at the end of a test. Well, there's a few ways we could run this. So this is just for an example. So here we're going to set up a test fixture here and we're going to utilize yield. So Pytest does have a yield decorator, but here we're just going to use a Python yield here. So we're going to run this print at the start of a test, and then at the end of a test we run this print just to showcase the fact that we can perform an action at the start and end of a test. So by doing this, let's create a simple test example. So we're going to run example 1 and then assert, so the yield fixture equals 6. All right, so let's go ahead and test this. So Pytest. So here we go. So you can see here we have the start of a test, we run the test, and then we have the end phase. So this example really is for a much more advanced session where we think about having to set up the test and then tear down the test at the end of the test. So let's think of something a little bit more tangible that's related to Django, where fixtures might become a little bit more important, or where we could start to utilize fixtures within our testing. It's very likely that when we test our Django application, at some point we're going to need to bring in our database or access our database. So here, this application here, it doesn't really have any tables, so we'll just utilize the Django's user model. So let's import that into our test. Right, so in order for us to access a database with Pytest, there's two ways, or there's a few different ways in actual fact to do this, but two main ways that we're going to look at. First of all, utilizing the Django DB declarator. Now, typically we utilize this when we want to access data within our test function. So that's going to give us access to our database. And so now what we can do is test that we can create a new user. So let's go ahead and try that. And so we're just going to run user_objects.createUser. 3 parameters here. That's going to be the username, the email, and then the first name. So once we've got that in place, we can then assert. So let's just check now and count how many users we now have in the user table. That should equal 1. So you will notice that I don't actually have a database here for the actual application. So when we're testing, a test database is created and we run the tests on that test database. So in addition, the database table, the testing database table, won't persist over separate tests. So take, for example, here, we count how many objects there are inside of the user table, objects all count, and then we just print that out. So let's do that first. So you can see that there is 1 item within the database because we've added a new user. So let's, for example, create a new test here. So we do the same thing again. Well, this time, actually, in fact, we'll take out adding a user to the database. Here, we're just going to count the objects in the user table. So here we could read this as we add a new user to the users table, we then count it, should be 1. So when we count it here again, it should still be 1, but of course that isn't the case. Now let's just go ahead and print this out down here so we can see this. So you can see this time we're now returning a 0. So the first test returned 1, the second test we return 0, and that just confirms the fact that the table that we build here doesn't persist over to the next test. So let's move this on and now introduce fixtures with a database. So I'm using a different example here. Don't apologize. Every example I make, I always just go along and comment it out. So all these tests are now, previous tests are commented out. So I'm just moving on to a new file. So I just copy and paste the file, rename it to example4 here. So we're going to need Pytest as per normal, and then we're going to continue utilizing the user table. If you're new to Django, I do apologize, I didn't really explain this. So this is the default user table that Django uses when we start a new Django project. It will create when we migrate the database. It will create a new table called user, and in there we would have the default users. So when we want to access the Django database in a fixture, we're working slightly different here. So whereas before we're using the declaration here, the Django DB, and that would be utilized for our test functions. Here, when we're using fixtures, we're going to bring in the database within the function here. So it is a parameter in our function. So whereas before we were accessing the Django database using the @Pytest mark.djangodb, so this time when we are using fixtures, we bring the database into the function. So here we're using Pytest fixture to build our fixture, and here we use the special DB to bring in the DB into our function, and then from here we can then run the database. So that now gives us database access, and you can now see I'm going to return user objects, create user, and then test user. So this first fixture here, user1, will create a new object, create a new user with the username of test user. So let's use this within a test. Now, in this test, we're going to access the database. So we need to use the declarator here, the mark Django DB. So now let's go ahead and create our function. So test set check password, and we're going to bring in our user1 fixture. And now what we're going to do is we're going to set the password. So we're going to essentially get this user and then set the password to new password. And now what we're going to do is run an assert. So let's just check the password is true. So let's go ahead and check our test. Looks like everything is okay. So let's just name or rename this, so new passwords. Let's see what happens. And you can see that we've failed. So you can clearly here see that we're testing the new password or the password for this test user against this password here, or against this string. If it is a match, then we obviously return true. If it doesn't match, then obviously we return an assertion error. So in our tests, we may want to extend from our fixture, add more data to perform tests. So of course, we may want our fixture to perform a function and just return data from a database, for example. So let's go ahead and just copy that down. Let's just copy this down. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just change this slightly. Let's go ahead now and build our user inside of the fixture here. So user equals, and then let's just return our user data. So now what we can do is we can access this within our test. So we don't need to access our database now within our test because that's all being performed by our fixture, by the setup. So all we need to do now is bring or start a new function, create a new function, bring in our user one, which is returning the user, and now we can perform our test, whatever that might be. So in this case, we're just going to test the username, just check to see if it equals test user. And of course, if it does, we have a successful test. And now we can see how to utilize or to set up data within a fixture and then utilize it within your test function. So very quickly then, before we move on a step, the previous test here was a good example of what we set out earlier. This paradigm here, pattern for writing a test, arrange, act, assert. It's pretty much all here now. So we're using the fixture to arrange. So we're arranging our data. We're going to create a new user. Then the second phase. So that was act, or the action. So the action here is that we set the password for that user. And then the third is the assert. So this third stage here, you can see that what we've done is we've tested the new password that we've set, and we tested to make sure that the new password matches new password. So that was a simple example of arrange, act, and assert. So before we move to the next stage, I just wanted to show you this now because it's easy to see in this one page. Right, so I've commented out the previous code. So what I've done here is I've created a print within the fixture, and I've created a copy and pasted the test down here. So we've got check password 1 and 2. Obviously it's coming from the same source, the same fixture here. So let's just remove the scope a second. So let's just run this. So clearly what's going to happen now is that this fixture is going to run for every test. It's set to function, our fixture by default. So it's going to run for each test. Now, it seems like a good idea to just run it once. It seems a bit strange how we would have to recreate this for every single test. So it just seems like a good idea to run this once. So let's go ahead and add a scope session. So remember from the previous test, or from the previous part, we were discussing the different scopes. So fixtures can persist over a whole session, for example, or in this case, if it was set to function for individual tests. So let's set it to a session. So we're going to try and make this available just once, run this once for both tests. So when we try and do that, it does return an issue here. And that's important. So we can't do that. We can't run a session, or we can't run a fixture like this and run it from 2 tests. So we're going to need to set up our code slightly different for that. And that moves us into this idea of factories, which we'll discuss in a little while. Hopefully at this point, you're getting a better flavor of what fixtures are for and how to use them. So let's just assume these are our tests for our application. Now, typically our fixtures would be placed in a different location. When we run Pytest, it will look for us a separate file, and this file is called Conftest.py. And this file can be utilized to set up our fixtures. So Pytest will look for this file before it runs any tests. So what we can in fact do is move across our fixtures. So let's do that. So I'm simply just copying that fixture. I'm going to put it in this file here. I'm going to need to bring in Pytest as per normal. So let's just import Pytest and let's just run it as it is. So there shouldn't be a problem. Let's just get rid of the scope because we know that doesn't work. Right. So I need the user. I'm going to need to bring in the database. So I can take that out of there. And now let's put it inside of here. There we go. So that solves that. So let's go ahead now and run our tests. So straight away, you can see that they still run. So even though I have my fixtures over here now in this new file, it's still being utilized by my tests here inside of this file here. So far, we've been using simple examples. And in addition to that, you can see here we've created objects with really few arguments. In this case, we're just passing over the username to generate a user. In reality, in our applications, of course, things will be more complicated. Objects would feature many more arguments with many possible values. The user table in Django, if you're not too familiar with this table, let's just go ahead and just build this table. And let's have a look at this table. That will give us a better idea and make it easy for me to explain. So I'm just going to migrate. Yep. I'm just going to migrate. You can see all the tables are created. Now I do have, and this is becoming a little bit of faux pas. I do have SQLite installed here as an extension, and that does allow me to go into the database. I always manage to fit that into my tutorials. So let's just open the database, and down here it is, and I can then go into the user table. So this is going to be let's just expand this a bit. So here you can see the author user table. So let's just show that table. So at the moment, there's nothing in there at the moment. So let's just go ahead and create a super user. Okay, so we've got username, email, optional, password. Yep. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Right. So with that in place, let's just have a look at the table again. We should be able to refresh. We've got something in the table now. So let's move that across. So you can see in this table that we've been utilizing in our tests, there's many different fields here. So we've got the ID, password, login, is super user, username, last name, email, is staff, is active. So if you imagine, if you wanted to run some tests on this user table, there's probably multiple fixtures that you want to build here to utilize in different tests. Maybe you'd want to build a fixture whereby you just want to create a normal user. And in addition to that, you would want to create a fixture where you're building a super user, an admin user, for example. So we could describe any function or class that creates an object as a factory. So here, this fixture here, we could describe this as a factory, as a fixture, in that this fixture here generates a user object and then passes it over to be utilized in a test. So just to establish my point again about all these fields that are in the table, if I wanted to, for example, in my test the admin password, what I would need to do here is I would need to build a fixture whereby I can then generate and create an admin user. If I wanted to build an admin user here in Django, I would need to make sure that I set the user to super user, is staff, and is active. Okay, so that's one fixture. Now, if I also then wanted to test in my test a normal user, I would then need to make a new fixture because this fixture would need to set up the user so it didn't have is super user, is staff, for example. So in this case, I want to use really the same, I only want to build one fixture for all of these cases. So this is a good situation where a factory would come into play, where we could build a factory as a fixture. This factory as a fixture is going to generate many different varieties of a user. I'm going to use it as a factory, a way of pointing my test when they need a particular type of user or a different setup for that user. So let's go ahead and build our factory here. Right, so we're going to create our fixture, and then we'll create a new function for this. So we'll call this new user factory. And then we're going to need some sort of return. So we're going to return create app user. Right. So now what we're going to do is have an inner function. And this is something that you can read around if you're not too familiar with this in Python. So Python inner functions, these are sometimes known as nested functions if you want to read around this. So here we've got a function inside a function. So now let's define our inner function. So we're going to need a database. So let's bring in the database. And now we're going to create this inner function here. So create app user. So this is going to actually create the user. So here we've got user equals user objects create user. Right, so we're going to need to pass in some arguments into this so that we can then build our user. So let's first of all go ahead and add these attributes, these arguments that we're going to pass into this function. So a username. So this is just going to follow the fields that are inside of the actual user table. So we're going to need a username, a password, a first name, last name, email, is staff, is super user, is active. So that's pretty much all the fields that you'll find inside of the table that we want to define. So let's go ahead now, and we now want to set this up. So we pass in these arguments into our function here. Now we can set them. So user equals user objects create user. So now we're going to use these arguments, the data that's passed in to our function, and use it to create a new user. So username, password, first name, last name, email, is staff, is super user, is active. So I've set some defaults here. So here, if you look at what's happened, we don't actually need to define everything. So we've set some of these arguments here with set values. So if we don't define them, then they would just be used by default. So in actual fact, all we need to do here to create a user is just define a username, and everything else will be set for us. So what we're trying to do here is build flexibility. So now we have this fixture in place. Let's go ahead now and build another fixture that is going to utilize this factory. So we create a Pytest fixture, and we create a new function. I'm going to call that user A. And here we're going to access the database. So let's do that. And then we're going to bring in our factory. So let's go ahead now and utilize this factory. So we return, we pass into the factory the username, a password, and then a first name. Of course, we can continue here and utilize more. So we're just following this pattern here. So username, test user, password, first name. So we could continue and use last name, email, is staff. And of course, what we're doing here is we're just overriding the set attributes here so that we can make those changes and provide that flexibility depending on what type of users we want to build. So I've gone ahead and just named this function new user. Right, so let's now go ahead and go back into our test example here, and let's see if we can utilize this. So the fixture is new user. So let's just retrofit that into one of our tests. Oh no, let's just let's build a new test. Right. Okay. So we'll just comment that out. So we're just running one test. Right. So this is called, we'll call this create or test a new user. And we're going to need to bring in our fixture, which is new user, which is obviously using our factory. So let's bring that in. And what I should now have is an instance, an object of the user object. So that's the user object which we've defined here. So now I should be able to access that. So let's just do that. Let's just do a print. So new user. So that should be the user object we should now have. So I can probably print out, for example, the first name. So let's try that. And then what I can say here is new user first name, use new user first name, that should equal my name. Okay, so that's what we've created when we built a new user. Right, so let's go ahead and test this. So Pytest, and there we go. So let's just check, because we're passing out the print, so we can do that obviously. And there we go, my name. So we printed out the username. This is the username that we've generated from the factory that we built and from the fixture that we built to utilize the factory. So let's go ahead and build a new fixture for a staff member, for example. So I'll just comment out this fixture for now. So we're just using one fixture. So let's build the same fixture again, but this time I want to make a fixture for a staff user. So in this case, I can just say is staff equals true. So I can pass that in and I can override if staff equals false. So this time, this user that I build here in this fixture will be a staff member, and I may want to run separate tests on this. Obviously, these will both be available if I want them to be. So let's just call that new user 1 and new user 2. So let's go ahead now and build a test for that. So this is what it's going to look like. So this time, this is going to be test user, new user 2. Yeah, so new user 2. So in this case, I just print out whether they are staff or not, just to confirm they're staff. And then what we can also do is just test whether they are staff or not. So let's just add in is staff. So new user 2 is staff. Let's remember that this is going to return true. So let's just remove this here. And let's run this again. And there we go. So we've got a pass test. So I do hope that was a gentle introduction to Pytest fixtures. Particularly for new developers, that can seem a little bit abstract because you have to have the foresight of understanding what potentially you want to test and just general coding concepts when utilizing Django to really kind of visualize how and where you might want to use fixtures. And in addition to that, you will, if you look at other code, you will find that there are plenty of other ways of utilizing fixtures and other tools that we can work on top of fixtures to generate fixtures automatically, for example. So there is a lot more to fixtures that I've shown you here in this tutorial. But like I said, hopefully that was a good introduction which we can then build upon. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that was useful, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.